It is just after 11 o'clock on the night of December 29, 1944. The island of Mindoro in the Philippines sits in complete darkness. Below, American engineers are still working, digging, grading, laying crushed coral, because the airfields they are building have to be ready in time for one of the largest amphibious invasions the Pacific War has yet seen. The Lingayen Gulf landings are 11 days away. General Douglas MacArthur needs those runways. Every hour of delay means American troops will hit the beaches at Luzon without adequate fighter cover. The Japanese understand this perfectly well, which is why they have been sending bombers every single night. Over the previous 2 weeks, there had been 334 separate air raid alerts on Mindoro. 334. That works out to more than 23 per day. Conventional bombers, reconnaissance aircraft, and kamikaze attackers came in rotation, probing, disrupting, destroying. Engineers working under floodlights had to scatter for cover. Construction slowed. The pressure on the men defending this island was relentless.
But on this particular night, one aircraft sat at Elmore Field, or McGuire Field as it was also known, with its twin engines turning over and its radar already warm. It was painted glossy black from nose to tail. It had a 66-foot wingspan, twin tail booms, and a distinctive central gondola fuselage that looked like nothing else in the American inventory. It was called the P-61 Black Widow, and the man in its cockpit was Major Carroll Smith, commanding officer of the 418th Night Fighter Squadron, 26 years old, 43 combat missions, and 4 confirmed kills already to his name. Behind him, in a separate compartment at the rear of that gondola, sat his radar operator, First Lieutenant Philip B. Porter. Porter had been tracking airborne contacts on glowing radar scopes for months. Tonight, the scope in front of him was not showing one contact, it was showing several. The Japanese had sent a force of bombers to finish what they started. What happened over the next 80 minutes would make Carroll Smith the highest-scoring American night fighter ace of the entire war.
But standing on the ramp that night, with the weight of 20,000 troops sleeping in tents below him and a half-dozen airfields under construction behind him, records were the last thing on his mind. He was focused on one question. Could one aircraft and 2 men hold back an entire Japanese bomber formation? To understand what Smith and Porter were able to do that night, you need to understand the machine they were flying, because the P-61 Black Widow was unlike anything that had ever flown before it. The story of the Black Widow begins in the darkness over Britain in 1940. When the Luftwaffe shifted from daylight bombing to night raids during the Battle of Britain, the RAF found itself in an impossible situation. Spitfires and Hurricanes were formidable in daylight, but at night, without visual references, without reliable instruments for tracking moving targets in 3-dimensional darkness, they were nearly helpless. The British began work on airborne intercept radar and modified aircraft to carry it. American military observers were watching closely. In September 1940, British scientists brought a collection of their most sensitive radar secrets to the United States as part of what became known as the Tizard mission. That exchange changed everything. Among the technologies transferred was the cavity magnetron, a device that could generate powerful microwave signals in a compact package. American engineers at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Radiation Laboratory immediately grasped its potential. Within months, they were working on a new airborne radar system that would exceed anything the British had yet produced. Meanwhile, Jack Northrop, the brilliant California aircraft designer whose ideas about flying wings and innovative aerodynamics were already decades ahead of their time, submitted a proposal for an aircraft built from the ground up for night fighting. Not a converted bomber, not a modified fighter, a dedicated night predator designed around the radar it would carry. The Army Air Forces approved the concept in January 1941 and ordered 13 service test aircraft. The result was enormous. The P-61 weighed more than twice as much as a P-47 Thunderbolt at takeoff. Its 66-foot wingspan was comparable to a medium bomber. It carried a crew of 3, pilot, gunner, and radar operator, each in their own section of the central fuselage gondola. 2 Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engines, producing 2,000 horsepower each, hung from the twin tail booms and drove 4-bladed propellers. Top speed exceeded 360 miles per hour. Range stretched beyond 1,000 miles. The aerodynamics were unconventional in ways that ended up being advantages. The twin-boom configuration, similar in broad concept to the P-38 Lightning, gave the Black Widow exceptional stability in another aircraft's airstream, which mattered when you were trying to close in close on a target in total darkness without being thrown off by its wake turbulence. The aircraft used spoilers on the upper wing surface for roll control rather than conventional ailerons, a technique that improved handling at low speeds. And despite its size, pilots consistently described it as forgiving, smooth, and capable of a surprisingly tight turning radius.
One pilot famously got into a turning contest with a German Bf-110 and actually bumped wings before pulling away, and walked away impressed by how the big aircraft handled. But the real weapon was the SCR-720 radar mounted in the nose. The SCR-720 had been developed by MIT's Radiation Laboratory and represented the most advanced airborne intercept radar the United States had produced. It used a technique called helical scanning. A rotating parabolic dish in the nose transmitted microwave pulses across a 180-degree forward arc. When those pulses struck another aircraft, they bounced back. The radar operator's scope displayed two views simultaneously: azimuth showing left or right position relative to the aircraft's nose, and elevation showing whether the target was above or below. Maximum detection range in intercept mode was nearly 5 miles. The SCR-720 weighed 415 pounds, not counting cables. It was a serious piece of equipment, and it was classified at the highest levels. Wartime sensors routinely removed images of the antenna dishes from official photographs. The Japanese had no equivalent system. Their bombers flew at night because they believed darkness made them safe. The Black Widow existed specifically to prove them wrong. Major Carroll Smith had been working towards this night for years. He had trained at Orlando Army Airfield in Florida, one of the first graduates of the Army Air Force's specialized Night Fighter program. Night fighter training was exhaustively demanding. Pilots learned to fly entirely by instruments, to ignore the visual instincts that conventional flying depended on, to trust their radar operators implicitly. There was no room for error. At night over the ocean, with no visible horizon, a disoriented pilot could fly into the water before he realized he was descending. Every night mission was an exercise in disciplined focus. Smith had joined the 418th Night Fighter Squadron when it was first organized at Orlando in the spring of 1943. The squadron's journey to the Philippines was itself a story of adaptation. They started with P-70 Havocs, modified Douglas A-20 attack bombers with primitive radar, flying defensive patrols over New Guinea. The P-70 was underpowered and its radar was unreliable, so the squadron transitioned to modified P-38 Lightnings for night intruder work, and then briefly flew B-25 Mitchell bombers on night harassment missions. They moved base after base as MacArthur's forces island-hopped northward: Dobodura, Finschhafen, Hollandia, Modotai. Each new base brought new threats, new terrain, new problems. When the P-61s arrived in September 1944, everything changed. The Black Widow was, as one pilot put it, what the previous aircraft should have been all along. The radar worked. The aircraft was stable. The performance was there. Smith's first 4 kills had come on Modotai between September and December, proof that the combination of his airmanship and Porter's radar skills was genuinely lethal. Philip Porter had been flying as Smith's radar operator for months by the time the 418th arrived on Mindoro on December 26th, just 3 days before the mission that would define both their careers. Porter's job was arguably the more technically demanding of the two. He had to read 2 scopes simultaneously, translate those readings into verbal instructions, maintain a mental picture of the geometry between his aircraft and the target, predict the target's movements, and keep Smith oriented through darkness so complete it was essentially a physical substance. Night fighter doctrine was built on the understanding that pilot and radar operator were a single weapon system. Neither was effective without the other. At 11:42 in the evening, Porter's voice came through the intercom. He had 4 separate contacts on his scope, all heading south toward Mindoro, all at different altitudes. The first contact was a Mitsubishi G4M, what American pilots called the Betty. The Betty was the Imperial Japanese Navy's workhorse land-based bomber throughout the Pacific War. Twin Mitsubishi Kasei radial engines, a range of over 3,000 miles, a bomb load of up to 1,760 pounds. In the early months of the war, Bettys had been shockingly effective, playing a central role in sinking the British battleships HMS Prince of Wales and Repulse off Malaya in December 1941. But the Betty had a fundamental design flaw baked into its bones from the very beginning. To achieve the extraordinary range the Japanese Navy required, designer Kiro Honjo made a fateful choice. he omitted self-sealing fuel tanks entirely. The wings were essentially enormous fuel cells with no protection. Allied pilots took to calling the Betty the Flying Lighter or the Flying Cigar. One burst of cannon fire into the wing was often enough to turn a Betty into a fireball. The Americans also noted with some dark appreciation that Japanese crews sometimes kept flying even when badly damaged, but when the Betty burned, it burned fast and it burned completely. Smith pushed his throttles forward. The twin R-2800 engines surged. Porter called out vectors. Heading 035, altitude 8,000 feet, range 4 miles. The Black Widow climbed at 2,000 feet per minute through absolute darkness. No moon, no stars, the cloud layer pressing down over everything. Smith had his own radar scope in the instrument panel, a smaller display integrated alongside his flight instruments. When Porter got him close enough, Smith could take over the tracking himself, closing the last few hundred yards on his own.
The system worked because it assigned each task to the person best positioned to perform it. Porter with the wide field picture, Smith with the close-in kill shot. At 500 yards he saw the Betty. Not with his eyes, there was nothing to see in that darkness, but as a shape, a dark mass against a slightly less dark cloud. The faint orange glow of the exhaust stacks marked where the engines were. Smith positioned the P-61 below and slightly behind the target, where the Black Widow would be hardest to spot, and the 4 forward-firing 20mm Hispano M2 cannons would have a clear shot into the bomber's belly. The N6 gun sight projected an illuminated reticle onto a combining glass in the windscreen. Smith centered the Betty in the reticle. At 350 yards, he squeezed the trigger. 2 seconds. 48 rounds of high-explosive 20mm shells streamed upward into the Betty's right wing. The fuel ignited instantly. The wing broke apart in a sheet of fire. The Betty rolled right, nose down, and fell burning toward the water. It hit the sea 8 miles north of Mindoro at 11:57 at night. 1 down. Porter already had the second contact.
The second Betty was 23 miles away, flying at 6,000 feet, already closer to the island than the first had been. Smith pushed the throttles forward again, and the engines drank fuel at a rate he was tracking carefully. At high power settings, every minute consumed resources he might desperately need later. He caught the second Betty at 12:19 in the morning, approaching from below and behind in the classic Night Fighter attack geometry that minimized his own silhouette and maximized his firepower angle. Another 2-second burst. The right engine caught fire, then the left, both wings burning simultaneously. The bomber pushed over and dove. It hit the ocean at 12:19 in the morning. 2 bombers down. 2 bombers. Fuel at 42%. Porter had 2 more contacts on his scope. This was where the night became complicated. The third contact was at 9,000 feet, the fourth at 4,000. They were 8 miles apart. Smith had to choose which to go after first, knowing that the time he spent on one would give the other more time to close on the airfields below. He went for the higher target, climbing north, and when Porter locked onto it, something was immediately different. This aircraft was moving in a way the first 2 hadn't. It was turning, changing altitude, altering heading. Someone aboard knew the Americans had night fighters in the area, and they were trying to make themselves harder to track. This was a Nakajima Ki-49 Donryu, codenamed Helen by the Allies. The Helen was a Japanese Army heavy bomber, a design that had been intended to replace the older Mitsubishi K-21, but had never quite lived up to that ambition. Its 2 Nakajima Ha-109 radial engines produced about 1,500 horsepower each, giving it a maximum speed of around 306 miles per hour. It was better armed than the Betty. Unlike the Navy's notoriously vulnerable G4M, the Helen had self-sealing fuel tanks and some armor protection for the crew. Its tail turret carried a 20mm cannon with a clear field of fire directly behind the aircraft. Getting into a straightforward stern attack on a Helen was an invitation to get shot. Porter watched the contact through its evasive turns, building a picture of the pattern, predicting the next move based on the previous ones. Smith closed carefully, approaching not from dead astern, but from below and to the left, the bomber's ventral blind spot. Most Japanese bombers of this period had limited downward coverage. Smith was exploiting that gap. At 375 yards, the Helen's tail gunner opened fire anyway. Tracers streaked past the P-61's canopy. Whoever was back there had sharp eyes or sharp instincts, even through the absolute darkness.
The element of surprise was gone. Smith had seconds before the pilot put the aircraft into aggressive evasive maneuvers that would shake him off. He squeezed the trigger. 3 seconds, 72 rounds, his longest burst of the night, necessary because the target was already moving. The 20mm shells tore through the Helen's right engine housing. The engine exploded. The bomber rolled inverted and entered a flat spin downward. Burning, it passed through 9,000 feet, 8,000, 7,000. It hit the water at 12:29 in the morning. 3 down. Fuel at 28%. That 28% number deserved serious attention. Standard practice for night fighter pilots called for returning to base at 30% fuel. Below that threshold, any unexpected delay, a navigation error, a crosswind, a missed approach, could leave you over the ocean with dry tanks and no options. Smith was already past that line.
But Porter had one more contact on his scope. The fourth bomber, the one at 4,000 feet that Smith had bypassed to go after the Helen, was now only 12 miles from the airfields. From this altitude, in this direction, Smith could see the searchlight beams from the American defensive positions sweeping the sky. Anti-aircraft gunners were at their stations. The fourth bomber was close enough that those guns would open up soon, and bombs dropped near half-finished runways and engineering equipment in the middle of the night could set the invasion timeline back by weeks. Smith pushed over into a descent. Descending burns less fuel than climbing, and gravity was helping him now. He leveled off at 4,200 feet, just above the target, and closed the range. 3 miles, 2, 1 mile. He had the Betty visually at that distance. Another one. The pilot was flying straight and level, no evasive action, either unaware that a night fighter was hunting him or grimly committed to completing his mission regardless of the cost. Both possibilities were consistent with what American crews knew about Japanese bomber crews by late 1944.
The kamikazes were a relatively recent formalization of something that had always been present in the Japanese Air Corps, a willingness to accept death as the price of mission completion. Smith checked his ammunition counter, just over 500 rounds remaining. His fuel gauge showed 23%. One shot at this. If he missed or failed to bring the bomber down, he would not have enough fuel to chase it again. He fired at 12:34 in the morning. 2 seconds. The 20mm shells converged on the Betty's center fuselage. The port wing separated from the aircraft. Fuel tanks ruptured. Fire spread across the remaining structure in seconds. The Betty rolled left and dove. It impacted the sea at 12:35. 4 bombers in 55 minutes. Smith turned south toward McGuire Field, with his fuel gauge showing 21%. Any reasonable person would say the mission was complete. 4 kills, 0 American casualties, the airfields protected, the invasion timeline intact. Remaining fighters still somewhere in that dark sky would have seen 4 flaming fireballs plunge into the ocean in less than an hour. The remaining 8 Japanese aircraft in the original formation had already turned for home. Whether they lost their nerve or simply made a rational calculation that whatever was out there in the darkness was too dangerous to engage, they were gone. Smith was heading home. His fuel gauge was counting down. McGuire Field was 18 miles south. The math was tight but workable. And then, at 12:42 in the morning, Porter's voice came through the intercom again. New contact. Range 4 miles. Altitude 7,000 feet. Heading north. This contact was between Smith and his base. If it was a Japanese aircraft heading toward Mindoro, letting it pass meant all 4 kills of the previous 55 minutes might be rendered meaningless if it bombed the airfields and killed engineers who had survived the night so far. But intercepting it would drop Smith's fuel below any margin of safety. If anything went wrong after the engagement, he might not make it back. Smith turned toward the contact. This time it wasn't a bomber. As the range closed and Smith acquired the aircraft visually at 800 yards, he recognized the profile immediately. Single engine, short fuselage, a fighter. Specifically, a Nakajima K-84 Hayate, what Allied pilots called the Frank. The Frank was, by any objective measure, one of the most capable fighters Japan produced during the entire war. Its 1,900 horsepower Nakajima Ha-45 radial engine could push it to 392 miles per hour in level flight, faster than the P-61. It was more maneuverable, had a higher rate of climb, and carried 2 12.7mm machine guns and 2 20mm cannons. Unlike many Japanese designs from earlier in the war, the Frank had armor protection around the cockpit and self-sealing fuel tanks. The K-84 was what the Allies would have called a serious opponent. Post-war testing of a captured example on American fuel saw it hit 422 miles per hour.
In a daylight engagement, the odds would have been complicated at best. In total darkness, however, the geometry reversed. The Frank pilot was flying blind. He had no radar. He had no way to detect what was behind him. He was searching visually for American aircraft in a sky so dark there was nothing to see. Smith positioned the P-61 low and behind the fighter. Range 500 yards, 400, 300, fuel at 17%. The same attack geometry he had used 5 times already tonight.
Closer than on the bombers, because a fighter was a smaller, harder target, and armor protection meant a short burst might not finish the job. He fired at 12:45 in the morning, 3 seconds. The shells tore through the Frank's tail section and engine. The engine erupted. Black smoke poured from the cowling. The fighter rolled right and dove downward. Smith watched it descend. 7,000 feet, 6,000, 5,000. At 3,000 feet, the pilot ejected. A white parachute opened in the black sky. The KA-4 continued down and hit the water at 12:46, 5 kills, 63 minutes of combat, fuel at 15%. The approach to McGuire Field should have been the end of it. Simple arithmetic. 11 miles at cruise speed, 22 minutes of fuel remaining, plenty of time. Smith began his descent. Porter was using the radar scope to navigate. The coastline of Mindoro showed clearly as a solid return, the field identifiable by position relative to the beach. At 12:55 in the morning, 3 miles from the runway, at 800 feet altitude and 140 knots, the runway lights went out. All of them. Every one of the 12 kerosene lamps that marked the landing strip extinguished simultaneously. Complete darkness below.
Without runway lights, there was no visual reference for landing. The radar altimeter could tell Smith how high above the ground he was, but it couldn't tell him if he was lined up with the runway, if there was equipment in his path, if his approach angle was right. A blind landing on crushed coral in a 31,000-pound twin-engine aircraft at night was not something in any manual. Fuel at 9%. McGuire was the only option within range. Smith descended using compass heading and the radar altimeter. Heading 180. The runway ran north-south. If his dead reckoning navigation was accurate, the runway would be directly ahead. He extended flaps to full and reduced to 100 knots, keeping 15 knots above the aircraft's stall speed as a safety margin. His rate of descent was 300 feet per minute. He watched the altimeter. 250 feet, 200, 150, 100, 75, 50, 25. The main wheels hit crushed coral at 12:59 in the morning. Hard impact, harder than normal, but the gear held. The nose wheel came down 3 seconds later. Smith applied brakes. The P-61 decelerated through 100 knots, 80, 60, 40, and came to a stop somewhere on the runway in complete darkness. Fuel gauge 6%, 29 gallons remaining.
3 minutes of flight time. Ground crew arrived with flashlights and guided the Black Widow to its parking spot. The engine shut down at 1:03 in the morning, 63 minutes after the first kill. Smith climbed out of the cockpit on stiff legs, hands shaking. Not from fear, he would later say, but from the sustained concentration of over an hour of the most demanding flying the night had demanded. Porter emerged from the rear compartment. The 2 men stood on the ramp under the Philippine stars. The airfields below them were intact. The engineers were still working. Intelligence officers arrived at 1:15 to debrief Smith. He gave them times, positions, aircraft types from memory. 4 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, 1 Nakajima K-49 Helen bomber, 1 Nakajima K-84 Frank fighter. The officers cross-referenced his account with ground radar tracks, Coast Watcher reports, and aerial searches at first light. Every contact was confirmed. Every aircraft was exactly where Smith said it would be. 4 kills in a single night matched the existing record for American night fighter pilots. 5 kills, including the Frank, exceeded it. But Major Carroll Smith was not finished.
The following afternoon, December 30th, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft were spotted over Mindoro. Single-engine fighters probing the American defenses. Smith and Porter took off again in the same Black Widow, refueled and rearmed with a full load of 800 rounds. At 3:12 in the afternoon, Porter picked up a contact at 12,000 feet, heading north. Another Frank. Smith had altitude advantage and dove on the fighter from above, closing to 400 yards and firing a 2-second burst. The enemy aircraft's engine exploded on the first pass. It rolled inverted and dove into the ocean. 7 confirmed kills total, all within less than 24 hours of flying. No other American night fighter pilot in any theater, Pacific, European, Mediterranean, or China-Burma India, would equal that total for the duration of the war. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron continued operations from Mindoro through January 1945 and beyond.
In the 13 nights following December 27th, the squadron had accumulated 12 of its 18 total victories of the war. Smith's 7 kills represented 39% of the entire squadron's wartime score.
Philip Porter received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his role as radar operator in those engagements, a recognition that formalized what Smith knew from the very beginning. Every one of those kills was a team effort. Without Porter's skill, his situational awareness, his ability to thread Smith through total darkness onto 5 consecutive targets in a single patrol, none of it would have been possible. The Mindoro airfields Smith defended that night were completed on schedule. American forces landed at Lingayen Gulf on January 9, 1945, exactly as planned. P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts operating from those same airfields provided the air cover that General MacArthur's ground forces needed to push toward Manila. Engineering estimates later concluded that significant bomb damage to the construction zones would have delayed airfield completion by as much as 2 weeks. 2 weeks that would have rippled forward through the entire Philippine campaign. Carroll Smith survived the war.
He returned to the United States in early 1946, eventually retired from the Air Force as a colonel in 1970, and never wrote a memoir or sought public attention for what he had done over the Philippine Sea in the early hours of December 30, 1944. The only records that exist are the dry entries in military archives, the intelligence reports, the unit histories, and the testimony of the men who were there. The aircraft itself, his Black Widow times a Waston, was scrapped after the war ended, like the vast majority of the 674 P-61s that were built. Only 4 complete examples survive today, none of them the aircraft that hunted 5 Japanese planes in 63 minutes while burning down to the last few gallons of fuel, and then landed blind on a darkened runway in the Philippines. The Black Widow had been controversial from the moment it entered service. Critics argued it was too slow, too heavy, too limited. They were not entirely wrong. It lost speed competitions to converted bombers. It was outrun in level flight by some of the aircraft it was meant to intercept. But the critics were measuring the wrong things. Speed and conventional performance mattered in daylight, in a turning fight, in the kind of combat the P-61 was never designed for. What mattered at night, with the Black Widow did better than anything that flew before it, was finding targets in total darkness and putting them on the bottom of the ocean before they ever knew it was coming. Over Mindoro, over Mortars, over Saipan, over every forward base that American forces needed to hold as they pushed toward Japan, that capability kept men alive who would otherwise have died. It protected engineers building runways in the dark. It covered invasion fleets that had no other protection when the sun went down. Major Carroll Smith and the P-61 Black Widow were proof of what can be accomplished when the right machine and the right men find each other at the right moment. 4 Japanese bombers and 1 fighter disappeared from the sky over Mindoro in 80 minutes of December 1944. The Japanese had no idea what was hunting them until they were already gone. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a second to hit that like button. It makes a genuine difference in helping us reach more people who love military history told the right way. Subscribe to WW2 Tales if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. We dig through archives, unit histories, and first-hand accounts to bring you stories like this one. Real people, real decisions, real stakes. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We have viewers all over the world, and every one of you is part of keeping these stories alive. Major Carroll Smith never sought credit for what he did. The least we can do is make sure people remember it.